Good morning to everyone in and around this courtroom. Mr. Registrar, would you please call the case?
Thank you. Good morning, Your Honors. This is case number IT 0992T, the prosecutor versus Ratko Mladić.
Thank you, Mr. Registrar. Before we start, there are two small issues I'd like to raise. The first one is that it was reported to the chamber yesterday that some inappropriate gestures were made from the public gallery into the courtroom. The chamber took it seriously. We have adequately dealt with it. I think, Mr. Lukic, you're aware of how we did that. It may be clear that we expect from the audience as well a proper behavior. You're aware of what the chamber exactly did in order to prevent it to happen again, and I'll leave it to that at this very moment. That's one. The second issue is that yesterday I think the defense filed a motion for the admission of 3 more statements in relation to sentencing, and I wonder when the prosecution would respond to that. Because if there would be an expedited response, that may make it easier to deal with those matters during final argument.
And we will indeed expedite our response, Mr. President.
Yes, and what does that actually mean, Mr. Tieke?
What about, well, certainly depends on how soon you want it, but I would think close of business Thursday.
Yes. That's okay. Then both parties still have an opportunity. If we would grant to address the matter in the final arguments, finally at the very late stages, and if we would not grant it, it would be clear as well before we finish the final argument.
Certainly, and we'll do our best to make any submissions even prior to that if we can.
Yes, if that would be possible, that would be appreciated. Any other matter to be raised? Not. Then, Mr. Traldi, would you please proceed?
Thank you, Mr. President, and good morning. The defense claimed the VRS protected Muslim villages in several municipalities, including Sanski Most, Kluch, and Rogatica. The municipalities they refer to compellingly demonstrate the pattern of crimes which comprised the cleansing campaign. For instance, the defense claims in paragraph 686 of its brief that 3,000 non-Serbs remained in Sanski Most and, quote, no hostile actions were taken against them, citing 6th Brigade officer and crisis staff member Nenad Davidovic. Now, first, that's 3,000 out of a pre-war population of more than 28,000. When you're thinking about how that dramatic demographic change was achieved, consider Davidovic himself admitted at transcript pages 31550 and 31557 that Serb authorities in Sanski Most took the position that anyone considered, quote, unloyal to the Serb authorities should be expelled with their families. And you see now on your screens P7418, page 24. 7418. Davidovic's own notes of a crisis staff meeting on the 8th of June, 1992, referring, among other things, to the need to move the Muslims and Croats out of Sanski Most to the extent that would ensure a steady control over power. As in other municipalities...
Mr. Traldi, when you're reading it and when I'm looking at what I see on my screen, it doesn't say out of out of Sansky most. Is the quote out of Sansky most, or is the quote without out of Sansky most?
The quote from the document is move the Muslims and Croats to the extent that would ensure a steady control over power.
Thank you. So without the out of Sansky most.
Yes, Your Honor.
Yes, please proceed.
In Sansky most, as in other municipalities, these people were moved out through terrible crimes, including mass arrests, 5 charged massacres, and the destruction of their homes, villages, and sacred places. I've lost my live note connection for a moment, and I think we generally have, which is why I'm pausing, Your Honor.
Yes. Once you're reconnected. We all have. And let me see. Yes, it stops there. Let's wait for a second. Apparently the transcription is functioning again. As always, it emphasizes how much we depend on the good services of our transcriber, which is highly appreciated. Mr. Traldi, would you please resume from where the transcript stopped, that is in Sansky Most, as in other municipalities? I take it these people were moved out, and then take it up from there.
They were moved out through terrible crimes, including mass arrests, 5 massacres charged in the indictment, and the destruction of homes, villages, and sacred places. Catholic Bishop Komaritsa described the, quote, almost horrific massive evacuation by my faithful, especially from the Sansky Most and Priador regions, in an effort to save their bare lives. And that's P7011, page 2. Defense witness Kuprashinin admitted he knew about these crimes, and so did the 1st Ukraine Corps. And that's at transcript page 29820, 29821. Now, perhaps the most terrible of the crimes in Sansky Most was the massacre of at least 29 Muslim women and children in a garage in Hrustovo on the 31st of May, 1992. The women and children killed in the garage included a 75-year-old woman and children under 10 years old. The 6th Brigade then took credit for, quote, successfully clearing Hrustovo. And that's P2365, page 3. And we see here P2409, the Sansky Most crisis staff's decision just days after the Hrustovo massacre to send to Manyacha politicians, nationalist extremists, and those simply unwelcome in the municipality, which P2362 reflects meant non-Serbs generally. So the removal of non-Serbs from Sansky Most was a matter of policy. Similarly, the defense claims in paragraph 687 that Muslim villages were protected in Cluj. But when GRM 14 claimed Muslims were able to remain there and were protected, he was forced to admit Muslims left Cluj because of the crimes against them. That's transcript page 30397. And villages where he and other defense witnesses claimed Muslims had, quote, remained untouched. Republika Srpska records from the war showed that no Muslims, or very few, remained there at all. And you can see that, for instance, in P4071 and P3769. And you've also seen entries in General Mladić's notebook tracking Cluj's Muslim population through 1992, from 17,000 in January to 5,000 in September and 2,000 in November. In Rogatica, the defense refers to villages including Shatoravici, which they claim in paragraph 689 was a, quote, particular example of peace between Muslims and the VRS. But you've seen, too, what happened in Shatoravici. In October 1994, after Tolemir ordered the various VRS corps to implement an exchange, soldiers rounded up the Muslims of Shatoravici from their homes and shipped them to Sarajevo. We discuss this in paragraph 345 of our brief and in the Rogatica summary. And it's clear from defense witnesses Veselinović and Sokolović's admissions that when General Mladić entered Žepa in July 1995, he and his subordinates were in the process of shipping out almost all the remaining Muslims in Rogatica municipality. Now, Mladić's response to ethnic cleansing reflects he shared the common purpose and contributed to its implementation. The defense claim Mladić tried to punish his subordinates when they committed crimes, and he ordered disciplinary proceedings a number of times, You can see that in paragraphs 117 to 119 of our brief, paragraphs 795 to 796 of the defense brief, among other places. He had both the formal and functional authority to order disciplinary measures against subordinates. And as a commander who prized obedience and the proper functioning of the chain of command, who told the 16th Assembly at P431, page 42, we need to have absolute obedience. Without discipline, we have nothing. He used that authority. The thing the parties dispute is what Mladić used this authority for. The defense claims Mladić issued orders to punish soldiers who were, quote, behaving irresponsibly and committing offenses. But the evidence shows those orders were not issued for JCE crimes, and that his subordinate officers applied this policy of impunity for crimes against Muslims and Croats down the VRS's ranks. As we've done through our argument,
What was this authority used for, if it wasn't used for JCE crimes?
so first and foremost, Your Honor, you've seen the military justice system deal with crimes like desertion, crimes like armed rebellion. The defense witness named Radul, a Banja Luka military court prosecutor, admitted crimes against Serbs and crimes against the army came, and what was put to him was first, last, and only in the work of the Banja Luka military court, and he acknowledged that. And that's the type of crime that you see prosecuted in the system.
Thank you.
As we've done throughout argument, we'll look at one of the examples the defense gives. They cite P4453 in footnote 1674 of their brief to support their claim Mladić issued orders to punish crimes against non-Serbs. You see it on the screen now. It's a warning by then SRK Commander Tomislav Šipčić to Rogatica Brigade Commander Rajko Kuzic. And Šipčić writes on the 26th of June, 1992, that, quote, for the last time, I am warning you to refrain from massacre, rampaging, abusing the innocent population of any nationality. Whatever this order says about the officer who issued it, it illustrates the problem with the defense attempt to give Mladić credit for every seemingly humanitarian action taken by any VRS soldier. Soon after it was issued, Šipčić, the general who issued the warning, was replaced as SRK commander by Stanislav Galić, under whose command the 30th Division had already ethnically cleansed Muslim areas of Cluj, as we set out in our Cluj summary. Kuzic and his units, on the other hand, continued committing crimes against non-Serb civilians as part of the VRS all the way up to 1995. As you see here, he openly reported to the Drina Corps Command in P1064 on 7 August 1995 about the 5 remaining quote-unquote Balias who had been liquidated and the quote unarmed Ustasha who was liquidated, who had said before he died that he had fallen behind and was looking for food. Now, by the time he reported on the liquidation of those he called Balias, Kuzic was a lieutenant colonel. And you see here on your screen P3684, Mladić providing just one of Kuzic's several promotions during the war. And despite the massive and notorious Rogatica Brigade crimes against non-Serb civilians, P3689 gives you an audio recording of what Mladić thought of Kuzic. And I'm going to ask Ms. Stewart to play that now.
It would be very unfair if I didn't mention another important soldier of our army and officer, and that is Rajko Kušić, the commander of the Rogatica Brigade, who has been and remains, I believe, the alpha and omega of the peaceful sleep of Serbian children in this area. You too deserve every honor, Rajko.
So looking at this document reveals that the way to move up in the VRS was to be a successful ethnic cleanser, like Kuzic was in Rogatica. Rogatica had more than 13,000 Muslims in 1991. By the end of 1992, they were crammed into 3 small enclaves. And as I mentioned earlier, by the time Žepa fell, they were essentially all gone. And Kuzic's brigade had led this cleansing campaign. It was organized and armed by the JNA and SDS in March 1992. As we set out in our summary, from its inception, it was under the JNA 216th Brigade and Dragomir Milosevic. As Kuzic stated in P6931, and defense witness Jeric confirmed, the Rogatica Brigade was incorporated into the VRS on or about 19 May 1992, and then committed crimes against innocents at places including Razadnik Camp and the Veliko Vlahovic School, both under Kuzic's control. Razadnik detainees were tortured, sexually assaulted, humiliated, beaten, used for forced labor. Some detainees died from the beatings and the harsh conditions, including 101-year-old Hanka Kustura. Similarly, at the Vlahovic School, both brigade soldiers and Serb police beat, tortured, raped, and robbed detainees. Other detainees could hear both men and women screaming during the night as they were sexually assaulted. And that's in P309, paragraphs 69 to 77, and P2223, page 4. I detail these because the defense suggest, in their Rogatica section of their brief, that non-Serbs went voluntarily to Razadnik and the Vlahovic School, and argue that references on VRS lists to prisoners being held at Razadnik were fictions to facilitate the exchange of those people. But the non-Serbs at Razadnik and the Vlahovic School were, of course, not there voluntarily, as demonstrated not only by documents like P6804 and P6805, and by the evidence of the survivor witnesses that you've heard from, but by the simple logic that people do not tend to voluntarily remain in places where they and others are being regularly assaulted, raped, and otherwise tormented. You saw Mladić promoting Kuzic in P3684. That's one of his exercises of his personnel power. And you see some examples in his notebooks, main staff meetings to discuss promotions and commendations of subordinates. For instance, at P360, pages 149, 150, where we see him noting considerations about the appointments of Radmilo Zeljaya and Vladimir Arsic, who had led the 43rd Brigade during the ethnic cleansing of Prijedor in 1992. Both were promoted during the war. Arsic ended the war a general, as defense witness Rade Javrić admitted at transcript page 31424. And we set out at the end of our municipality narratives, as well as paragraph 487 of our brief, the notoriety of the cleansing campaign in a given municipality and evidence that Mladić and other VRS officers or JCE members expressed approval, often by promoting the people who had led that cleansing campaign in the municipality. And so you see Kuzic's rise paralleled throughout the charged municipalities. Arsic ends the war a general. Galić is appointed SRK commander. Radislav Krstic becomes eventually Drina Corps commander after the 2nd Romania Brigade cleanses Sokolac, as I discussed yesterday. Andrić, who we also looked at yesterday, becomes Drina Corps chief of staff after the Birac Brigade cleanses eastern Bosnia. Manjača camp commander Božidar Popović is promoted to full colonel. The VRS simultaneously attempted to conceal crimes. You see it here in Mladic's notebook, where he directs that information about the huge numbers of Muslims buried in the Tomasica mass grave be, quote, retained well so that unauthorized people don't find out. P358, page 155. You see it in Vlasenica Battalion Commander Slobodan Pajic's order that the public be prevented from finding out about the conditions Suzica prisoners lived in and prevented from bringing the detainees food. P193, page 4. You see it in the mass grave burials we discuss in paragraphs 492 through 498 of our final brief. As they covered up the crimes, Mladić and other JCE members praised the success of the cleansing campaign, and as Mr. Teager mentioned yesterday, worked to make this ethnically cleansed factual situation a permanent one. Naturally, then, they did not punish perpetrators. Now, the VRS acknowledged officers' responsibility to prevent crimes and punish perpetrators, and that where VRS officers didn't punish the perpetrators of crimes they knew about, quote, this in itself makes them answerable for these criminal offenses. That's P3352, page 8. Now, contrary to the defense suggestion in paragraph 2902 of its brief, that the main staff wasn't involved in the military justice system where such cases were to be tried, Mladić and Guerrero sent instructions to the military justice system. Milovanovic testified Guerrero and his sector monitored, controlled, and analyzed the system's work. That's transcript page 16919. And we set out the main staff's relationship with the military justice system in paragraphs 110 and 120 of our 110 through 120 of our brief. The defense argues in paragraph 678 that at times soldiers who committed crimes were sent to the front lines. And the record is clear that this facilitated more crimes. You heard it from VRS officers, RMA 802, from military court staff like Radul, and from defense witness Matijevic, that if you arm perpetrators and send them out to fight, it's no surprise, of course, when they reoffend.
Mr. Trolley, I was a bit puzzled to your reference to Defense Final Brief 2902, where I find something what seems to be unrelated, and I'm looking at the corrected version. It's about a Fontana meeting.
I had not intended to discuss the Fontana meeting, Your Honor. I'll check it at the break.
Yes, please do so.
It's in the course of the discussion of the Veligici School. The defense also rely on Mladic's and other JCE members' toothless cosmetic orders to follow the laws of war. Karadich's order purportedly to protect non-Serbs in municipalities including Sokolac, which they cite in paragraph 1502, is one example. And they ignore Tupajic's response, P3181, explaining that the 2nd Romania Brigade and the Sokolac MUP answered to their own chains of command, the Republic-level leadership, Mladić, Mijo Stanisic, Karadic. And they ignore, of course, what happened, the reality on the ground. The 2nd Romania Brigade continued cleansing Sokolac municipality. Its commander was promoted. Mladić and Galic and Karadic, as we note in our narrative, commended the brigade. And Brown explained such orders are meaningless without prosecutions and may indeed lead to more crimes. That's transcript page 19536. And you can see one vivid example in the case of Directive 1, where the defense referred to boilerplate language at the end of the directive to obey the Geneva Conventions, but we've shown the directive was implemented through several ethnic cleansing operations in different municipalities. On the other hand, sending the right message, a message that the VRS was serious about enforcing the law of war, you've heard wouldn't have required prosecuting every crime by a soldier. So while the defense focuses on logistical problems in the military justice system, they didn't have to prosecute all the cases, just enough to send a message. The fact that there was no intention to prosecute such crimes is reflected most clearly in the cases where you can tell from the evidence in the record there was enough evidence to go forwards. For instance, defense witness Radul again admitted at transcript page 35582 that where victims' bodies were available, the murder weapon was known, and the perpetrators confessed, there was no reason the military prosecutors couldn't get a conviction. For the massacres at both Veligici and Shkrljevita, two of the very small number of crimes where any perpetrators were ever arrested, nobody was punished for those crimes in the military justice system during the war, even though the bodies were available, the murder weapon was known, and the perpetrators had confessed. So any challenges the military justice system faced weren't the reason soldiers weren't prosecuted for crimes against non-Serbs. If they were, Mladić at Veligici, Kajtez at Shkrljevita, and others would have been convicted. The chambers received evidence, indeed, that the military justice system had prepared thousands of cases in 1992, P3535, and that cases involving Serb victims were aggressively prosecuted and perpetrators convicted. The defense nonetheless asserts that the military justice system didn't work, citing, among other documents, P3560. But in P3560, page 4, the military justice system notes that despite difficult conditions, the courts had achieved what they considered, quote, good results in 1995. Though you've gotten evidence that in that year, as throughout the war, no soldiers were prosecuted for crimes against non-Serbs. The reason those counted as good results was that the soldiers were doing what they were supposed to do, ethnically cleansing the territory that the VRS was responsible for making Serb. And, Your Honors, I'd ask to briefly go into private session.
We move into private session.
Now an open session.
Thank you, Mr. Register.
The defense alleges in paragraph 134 of its brief that when VRS officers became aware of killings in the municipalities, they took steps to conduct investigations in order to arrest and punish the perpetrators. The defense relies on evidence about massacres in places including Brishevo in Prijedor and several sites in Sanski Most. In Brishevo, you've received evidence everyone knew about the massacre: the VRS, civilian authorities, MUP authorities, but no perpetrators were punished. Defense witness Kupreshanin gave evidence he went there with 1st Krajina Corps officers after the massacre. He acknowledged Brishevo had been an unarmed village. And though he was inconsistent about which high-ranking VRS officers he told, you can see Talich knew about the massacre from, for instance, P7477, page 2. And Radul admitted his office didn't prosecute anyone from Sanski Most for crimes against non-Serbs. The defense also argues in paragraphs 866 and 867 that the VRS investigated and punished the murder of Mladić detainees Omer Filipović and Esad Bender, even though Mladić guard Radinković admitted at transcript page 31734 31734 that no one was prosecuted until more than a decade after the murders, long after Mladić was no longer in charge of the VRS. Radinković also admitted VRS military police committed to the murders, contrary to the defense suggestion in its brief that it was unidentified Chetniks. Indeed, the defense tries to muddy the waters at times about who committed the crimes at Mladić and what more senior VRS officers knew. But the sources they cite, like P229, a Mladić camp report to the Corps level security and intel department, that military policemen, quote, just don't understand that the prisoners are human. These reports reflect both that VRS soldiers perpetrated much of the abuse and that more senior level commanders were aware of it. Far from prosecuting perpetrators, the camp command covered up crimes. As one witness explained, he was ordered by Camp Commander Popovich to falsely certify that a detainee from Cluj who had been beaten to death, in fact, had died of pneumonia. That's P3124, pages 9 and 10. So the military justice system didn't prosecute the perpetrators of crimes against Muslims and Croats. We see the next line of defense in paragraphs 132 and 133 of the brief. Mladić did not know about or was selectively or partially informed about many of the charged crimes in the case. Now, we don't assert, nor do we need to prove, that Mladić was notified of every single crime through which his subordinates and those of other JCE members achieved the common purpose. But the very examples that the defense refers to reflect the weakness of this argument. I want to focus on 3 incidents the defense both suggests were investigated and that they suggest were partially or selectively reported. First, you've heard about the cleansing campaign in Kotrvaroš, beginning with the first witness in the trial. Elvedin Pazic talked about how his village of Hrvachani was shelled on Bayram, 1992. As Serbs announced on a megaphone, quote, Balias were going to be there soon. His family fled as Serb forces entered the village, burning houses, fled from village to village, eventually tried to return to Hrvachani, only to find that everything in the village, including their own home, had been burned, and wound up in besieged Večići. Now, you see in our Kotrvaroš narrative, Večići had become strategically important, and it had captured Mladić's attention. And what the VRS then did reflects several of the key patterns of the cleansing campaign. Mladić's unquestioned command, the VRS's implementation of the cleansing campaign through all the crimes that together comprised it, including mass murder, Mladić's knowledge that the campaign was being implemented through such crimes, and the VRS's attempt to cover the crimes up while failing to punish the perpetrators. Mladić issued an ultimatum. No man, woman, or child could leave Večići unless all weapons were surrendered. P2884, page 3. That's the order Slobodan Zhublinin was testifying about that I mentioned yesterday, when he testified it wasn't up to him to support Mladić's decision, just obey it. The men in Večići, including Bosnian Muslim fighters, but also teenage boys and a few women, formed a column and headed out at night through the woods, trying to reach Muslim-held territory. They were captured by the VRS, brought to the Grabovica school, a barracks for the Kotrvaroš Light Brigade, and then the women and children were expelled, and the more than 150 men were massacred. And the defense tries in its brief, paragraphs 1133, 1135, and 1142, to blame unidentified Serb civilians for the massacre, but its witnesses, including Krsić, admitted VRS forces took the prisoners to the Grabovica school, that the prisoners were the VRS's responsibility. The prisoners were separated, men from women and children, at Kotrvaroš Brigade Commander Novakovic's order. And Pazic saw a soldier who carried out the separation tell the detained women and children nothing would happen to them, but, as Pazic put it, quote, our men will pay. That's transcript page 577. And the evidence shows the women and children were then expelled and the men massacred. Now, I led into this by mentioning the defense claim that this was partially or selectively reported. You see here the first Kraina Corps report to the main staff from the 4th of November, 1992. You see the main staff knew that there had been a, quote, brutal massacre, unquote, of the captured prisoners. And you see here that the first Kraina Corps reported the next day that 150 so-called extremists had been killed in combat. As Brown told you, the first Kraina Corps is changing the story. That's transcript page 19561. And can we briefly go into private session again?
We move into private session.
Back in open session.
Thank you, Mr. Registrar.
The defense also refer to the massacre of about 80 Muslim prisoners at the Veligici school in Cluj. You've received the whole military court file, P3528, and that file shows the perpetrators were VRS soldiers, contrary to the defense claim in paragraph 64 of their brief that the Veligici perpetrators were JNA soldiers not under Mladić's effective control. You've heard witnesses and higher-level VRS commanders who weren't in Cluj knew about the massacre. First Kraina Corps Chief of Staff Kalechevich knew. That's transcript page 37242. Radul knew when he was still in Prijedor in the summer of 1992. That's transcript page 35538, 35539. And you can see from the military court file that Talic knew because the perpetrators wrote him and asked to be sent back to their units. As we set out in our Cluj summary, after they wrote Talic, they were released without a trial. So while the defense also cite Veligici as an example of a case where a crime against non-Serbs was investigated, and indeed, remarkably, the perpetrators were arrested for the crime, both their release after writing Talic and their subsequent re-release in 1993 in consultation with when two were rearrested reflect that higher levels of VRS command had no interest in punishing them for massacring almost 80 unarmed prisoners. Similarly, we set out in our brief that no one was ever punished in the military court for crimes at Bakovich that the defense referred to. And that's even though the camp administration and the military court were aware of the brutal murders of detainees, including those killed on work detail at the Žitopromet facility. In that instance, the camp administration falsely reported to the Red Cross that the victims were exchanged rather than killed. Now, the defense cites that evidence, alleging crimes at Bakovich were only partially reported to Mladić. But the witness you heard that from, RM-088, testified the VRS concealed crimes from the Red Cross and explicitly testified he didn't know of any false reports the camp sent to its superior command. Returning for a moment to the defense attempt to take credit for Šipčić's order to Kuzic not to massacre innocents, you see a similar attempt in Banja Luka. The defense relies, in paragraphs 832 to 834 of its brief, on witness Solaja's claim that there was no policy to expel non-Serbs from Banja Luka. Even though, as Mr. Tiger mentioned yesterday, Solaja admitted that Predrag Radić, who he claims did not have a policy of expelling non-Serbs, was under constant pressure from those, quote, at the political top, unquote, because non-Serbs had not yet been expelled in great enough numbers, and the mosques in Banja Luka had not yet been destroyed. This evidence demonstrates the JCE. The power was with those at the top who shared the common purpose. They criticized Radić for not expelling non-Serbs, and eventually the non-Serbs in Banja Luka were expelled. They complained that the mosques were still standing, and as you've heard, eventually all the mosques in Banja Luka were destroyed. And the Manjača evidence is similar. The defense take credit for one VRS soldier essentially shouting into the wind that the mass detention of non-Serb civilians at Manjača was not in the interests of the Serb people. He told his superior command prisoners were being, quote, brought in massively and in large quantities. No selection has been made. P220. And, quote, such people cannot be treated as war prisoners nor be brought to the POW camp. Incidentally, this camp can be considered as a detention camp, i.e. a camp for segregation of Muslims and Croats, which history will not forgive us, P221. The defense suggests this shows the VRS was seeking not to detain non-combatants at Manjača. What it shows instead is that one person expressed concern about this, and the Corps command knew perfectly well they were detaining people they shouldn't have been detaining. And as the evidence shows, they kept doing it. And we cite the evidence of this, for instance, in paragraphs 28 to 29 of our narrative. And the reason they would commit resources, space, guards, including Corps-level military police, food, though not very much, to detaining civilians becomes clear from Solaja's evidence again. As he admitted, the Bosnian Serb leadership conditioned the closing of the camp on the conveyance of the remaining detainees to third countries. That's why it was worth the resources to detain them, because the camp was part of the process of collecting and expelling them. Like the other crimes we've been discussing here, part of the common purpose. Your Honors, I see we're at the time for the break.
We are, Mr. Taldi, we'll take a break and we'll resume at 10 minutes to 11 o'clock.
All rise. We will leave it.